All right. Um, Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming during your lunchtime. My name is Rory Miller. I'm Professor of Government at Georgetown University and the editor of the volume that we're launching today. Just a very brief description of what this book is about before we get on to our four distinguished speakers. This book was commissioned by Hamad bin Khalifa University in recognition of the significant impact that the ongoing blockade has wrought on a domestic, on a regional, and on an international level. And I'd like to first thank Dr. Hasna, President of Hamad bin Khalifa University, and his team for supporting this project, especially Marielle Daphne, who contributed a chapter on the Qatar Foundation and its response to the blockade. I'd also like to thank Rudy Abu Gaba from, at the time, HBKU, who initiated the project, and Rima Ishmael and Genwa Yahya, who have seen it through to its completion and publication. I'd like to thank the forum organizers for hosting us, and my dean at Georgetown, Ahmed Dalal, for his enthusiasm from the outset for this project. Today we have 4 contributors of chapters, but there were 15 in total. Social scientists, economists, scholars of Islam and linguistics, communications and media specialists, experts in international relations and engineers. And one of the initial appeals of doing this project when I was asked was that it provided an opportunity for having a showcase of all the talent that is available in what I guess you could call the research institutions that are currently hosted under the auspices of the Qatar Foundation. And you have 6 institutions who contributed or whose participants in this chapter emanate from. So Georgetown University in Qatar, Texas A&M, Hamad bin Khalifa University, Northwestern University, University College London, and the Qatar Museums. And I chose 15 contributors, but I could have chosen 50. And one of the things I hope is that this project will give a boost to cross-campus and inter-institution cooperation and collaboration and research going forward. The second objective of this project was to document and to analyze the first year of this blockade from a variety of different perspectives. Social sciences, engineering, the arts, and in those terms, we have 4 great speakers today who I'll introduce very briefly, but what is not covered here, but which is covered in the book, is cybersecurity, energy security, including the impact of the blockade on things like international energy law and climate change, how the old and the new medias have presented this blockade and crisis, how the parties to the dispute have used new media tools like Twitter to promote their own perspective on the international stage, the religious debate that has been engendered by the blockade. And so these are just some of the examples of the different issues that we have looked at in what I think is a very valuable project. And of course, the 4 of my colleagues and contributors sitting here did a brilliant job in doing this. And what I'll do very briefly is just introduce them all, and then they can go in order of their seating and give a glimpse and a sort of insight into what they have contributed. So the first person to speak today will be my Georgetown colleague, Dr. Gerd Nodeman, who is Professor of International Relations and Gulf Studies at Georgetown. And he looked at the blockade from the perspective of foreign policy analysis. Then we have Dr. Mohammed Evron Tak, who is, if I get his title correct, is Assistant Dean for Community Engagement and Innovation, and Assistant Professor for Global Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Then we have Dr. Jocelyn Sage Mitchell, who is an Assistant Professor in Residence at Northwestern University in Doha. And then we have Dr. Tariq Al-Ansari, who is an Assistant Professor in the College of Science and Engineering at Hamad bin Khalifa University. And so Gerd will start by looking at foreign policy analysis. Evran will then come in and look at the issue of entrepreneurialism and how that has been impacted by the blockade. Jocelyn will look at the domestic policy opportunities of the blockade. And then Tariq will conclude by looking at food security, which is a hugely important and increasingly important issue. So please, Gerd, carry on.
Thank you. It's not working yet. Thank you. Yes, oof, yes, this is working. So I'm not claiming that this is the most important of the angles, that the 15 angles represented in the book, but it's an interesting angle, and it happens to be one of the things that I focus on, which is foreign policy analysis as a discipline, part of the wider international relations discipline, which is of course what we teach, amongst other things, at Georgetown. So I'll just give you a quick flavor of some of the things that I thought would this discipline could contribute to analyzing this current crisis, and at the same time to look at how this crisis might tell us a little bit about the discipline. So it's not just commentary on the blockade. It tries to be, as much of the book does, it tries to be part of a social science exercise. And just as a parenthesis, I was thinking, where else in the Gulf region could you actually undertake an exercise like this at the moment? And I couldn't really think of many, perhaps partially in Kuwait. So there are plenty of assumptions underlying a discipline like foreign policy analysis, and indeed international relations. There are different kinds of assumptions that inform different kinds of interpretations. So the most famous in international relations is realism, right, where that thinks of the world as an anarchic place, and the battle between, competition between states is one of dealing with this anarchy. And realists would say, it's all about power. States are bound to secure and perhaps increase their power in order to survive in this anarchical battle or competition. There are different versions of realism, but we don't need to go into that at this minute. Then there are others, like liberal institutionalists, who think that building institutions and interdependence is important. And then there are, to pick just one more strand of thought, constructivists, who think, well, actually, it's all very well to talk about material realities in the world out there, but they're not just givens. They only matter because of the way people interpret them. It's all socially constructed. The nature of that anarchical game is actually something that's socially constructed by the players amongst themselves. So that's the kind of broad background. And foreign policy analysis specifically delves down beyond or beneath the idea that it's all just a structured game. It's all that matters is the structure of anarchical competition. In fact, most foreign policy analysis folk would say you've got to pay attention, yes, to the material factors at home and the material environment and the region and the world, but you also have to look at how these things are then interpreted by those who make decisions. And what's important there are decision-making structures, which sit in political systems, so you've got to have attention for that. And also the proclivities and the personalities, the characteristics of the leaders in question. There are different ways of interpreting all of that, but essentially it comes down to thinking in this overall structure that the realists talk about, agency matters. That's to say, the people making the decisions, the organizations making policy are not simply helpless in this wider structure. They make a difference. One of the things that comes out of that is a recognition that often you can recognize a foreign policy role or a role conception on the part of a country or a leadership that is a longer term. There are certain features about how these leaders, how that country sees their position, its position in the world, what it is, what it should be, what their role should be. But the fact that those foreign policy roles are longer term doesn't mean that they are immutable. So, what does all of this mean for the Gulf states? First thing to note, in purely material factor, they're small, apart from Saudi Arabia, and they're very vulnerable. So, the vulnerability they've all got in common, they're also, of course, in a sense, attractive targets because of their resource wealth. So what do states like this do in this international game? They can, if the realists would say, well, they're going to try and build up their power. On the part of the smaller Gulf states, that might not seem a particularly viable option on its own. So there are other things that states do, according to international relations theorists. They have the choice, for instance, between balancing against the threats they see around them or bandwagoning with them. In the case of the Gulf states, the 6 Gulf states, the main threat, supposedly for some time, has been coming from Iran and Iraq, across different ideological periods. So the idea would be that these states are going to balance against such threats. How can they balance against them? Well, by looking to an outside hegemonic protector, right, a great power. That's what they've all done. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, I'd say there's something else that comes into this. It's that foreign policy role conception. It's not just about calculation of their realist interests. It's also a sense of what the Al Saud have always felt their role should be, and that's to be recognized as the major player on the Arabian Peninsula. That's always been part and parcel of their self-conception in foreign policy. So it's an ideational thing that comes alongside the realist calculation. What about the smaller 5 states? Well, again, so they have an additional threat, not just Iraq, Iran. For the 5 smaller Gulf states, and going back a century or more, one potential threat or active threat has always been the Al Saud. That's been managed, there's been fluctuations, but it's always been there. So how do they respond to that? Again, they've got a choice of balancing against, and then where do they look? They look for outside protection, or also gathering together, or they bandwagon with Saudi Arabia as it became in 1932. All of them have kind of navigated between these 2 options, but clearly Bahrain has plumped fully for bandwagoning with Saudi Arabia. It's become a dependency economically and strategically, whereas Qatar is perhaps the example of, the clearest example of balancing against the potential or actual Saudi threat by going full on for protection from, looking at its security and protection from a great power. Initially, of course, if you go back again a century, initially it was Great Britain, and then it becomes the United States. Now, in the case of Qatar, just like Saudi Arabia has this element of role conception that comes into foreign policy, so too, I think, for Qatar, that's been the case, clearly visible since the mid-1990s. There was some idea of what Qatar was supposed to be, could be, both domestically and internationally, and that it becomes allied with this search for security. Now, we do see long-term patterns in all of the Gulf states' foreign policies. Let me just list 3. 1, there's always been tensions and clashes amongst them. That's nothing new. 2, a pragmatic, by and large, pragmatic way of dealing with these. And 3, maintaining, even amongst tensions and clashes, maintaining face-saving ways of climbing down or allowing the other party to climb down. That's been, again, I recognize this over at least 100 years of policy in these states. Now, the Qatar crisis is a break, in some respect, a break in these patterns. It's not that their realist concerns disappear. It's not that role conceptions disappear, but it is clearly that the way in which this boycott was imposed, going right for the highest possible level, short of military intervention, and the way in which face-saving avenues for climbing down, for allowing others to save face, were completely blown up. That, I think, is unprecedented. So we've got to look for an explanation. I'd say the key element is that apart from longer-standing friction about Qatar's increasing status, the real explanation is that in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, the leaderships now in charge view plural voices or plural narratives about power and the Muslim Brotherhood as threats. And hence, Qatari policy, which is more tolerant of that kind of plurality, is also seen as a threat. So, given the way this is played out, to me it's perfectly obvious that the interpretation or the diagnosis of this issue on the part of the Saudi and Abu Dhabi leaderships was clearly flawed, to put it mildly. And so is the medicine applied. Again, it was flawed. Moreover, the considerations of the implications of applying that medicine clearly also hadn't been done, or no due diligence had been done there. So how do you explain this? Because it's not typical for the kind of policy patterns we've seen over the past century. I'd say very briefly 5 things. 1, decision-making structures in Saudi Arabia and the UAE changed fundamentally. The kind of dispersed pool of thought and expertise and deliberation that featured, that characterized Saudi and UAE decision-making has gone. 2, that brought the personalities of the particular proclivities of the people in charge, MBS and MBZ, into far greater relief. 3, there is a material factor that the realists would look at involved as well, which is in particular that Abu Dhabi's and UAE's military capability has been built up to a much greater extent, so to begin to match some of their ambitions. 4, the evolving role conceptions that characterize the current leaderships in Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia, therefore had a possibility to grow, to develop, and indeed to be executed. But the final factor, the 5th factor that really enabled for this to take effect properly was a change in the environment, and the key change there was the advent of Donald Trump. So a quick few conclusions, and you can read the rest in the book. One is that states' foreign policy is of course in part related to their having to play the game in this anarchic environment, and so its relative size and power of states is important, but it's not the only thing that drives or defines policy. One is that the calculation of interests in this environment is done by individual leaders, and in this particular environment, these leaders are not constrained by the bureaucratic apparatus, the bureaucratic foreign policy apparatus one normally associates with foreign policy making. 3, the 3rd point, is that policy is also in large measure shaped by role conceptions. So it kind of confirms something to feed back into the discipline of foreign policy analysis. Now, in some cases, let's look at Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. They match what some people in the realist school, namely particularly the offensive realism, would say states would do. That's to say, offensive realists say what states will typically do in this anarchic environment is to proactively attempt to increase their relative power in their regional environment. So arguably that is exactly what Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia have been doing. And the final thing is that the realists don't have it all their own way. It's also the constructivists might have something to claim here, because clearly regional systems features are as much a function, I would say, of worldviews and perceptions amongst leaderships as they are of material facts. And I'll leave the rest for discussion.
Thank you very much. Everyone, please go ahead.
Okay, the timer on. Can you hear me? Yes, perfect. Okay. First of all, thanks to Professor Rory Miller for approaching me a couple of years ago. After the blockade, when the whole project was still new, and it has been such a source of pleasure and honor for me to be part of this. And my chapter asked a very important question, and it coincided with some of the other work that I was doing. So, entrepreneurship in Qatar, is a blockade a golden opportunity? And the answer to this question is yes. And very briefly in this chapter, I try to showcase the top-down and bottom-up perspectives and dynamics that have been visible, especially the second one, the bottom-up perspective, becoming more and more visible after the blockade. Whereas in the past decade or so, we have been seeing the top-down perspective of creating a state-sponsored, state-led entrepreneurship ecosystem in Qatar. So the blockade has been a nice testing ground to see if the efforts of the government in the past decade or so has been successful to meet the demand of the social forces to become entrepreneurs. This is just an example of, for instance, from 2016, a conference that most of the time we would discuss the role of the government in a market-oriented economy, or the regulatory issues pertaining to become entrepreneurs, the need, the legal requirements, the policies towards the entrepreneurial infrastructures. But if you look at it a bit more in depth, this was a product of Silatech in 2013, and it showcases how well structured Qatar's entrepreneurship ecosystem, from the government sector to support organizations, the media, education institutions, finance, corporations and incubators. And so there has been lots by the state in the past decade to create a state-led entrepreneurial ecosystem. The post-blockade, we have seen many examples of how the governmental sector, the governments, the public sector actually has been pushing for responses to the needs of the economy, like the Own Your Factory in 72 Hours project, the Jahiz 1 and 2, and also many surveys showcasing how the Qataris are now becoming more and more interested in being entrepreneurs. But at the same time, it was a coincidence that we were granted by Qatar National Research Fund a research grant on localizing entrepreneurship education. So yes, the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Qatar has been very rich. It was quite multidimensional, multifaceted, well-structured, but what was missing? The missing part was the bottom-up perspective, which is who are the beneficiaries, recipients of this ecosystem, mainly the young youth Qatari entrepreneurs. So we start to discuss and try to understand why level of entrepreneurship or the intentions, the aspirations, the attitudes towards being entrepreneur has been low. So we pretty much looked into the educational side of it, the training side of it, and coincided with another event that we did. So our intention was, yes, there has been a very strong state-led entrepreneurial ecosystem, but who is there? Who are the young Qataris who are going to be the futures and who are building an entrepreneurial, who are the beneficiaries of this ecosystem? So we did this event, it was a maker space this year on green economy and business and entrepreneurship in Qatar, trying to understand how economic behavior has been really rooted and embedded in social and cultural fabric. And we saw something very interesting. We saw so many young Qataris for instance, in fashion industry, in waste management, for instance, this is one of them is about electronic waste, or mechathons or hackathons, like competitions, and so much enthusiasm to understand and to enhance entrepreneurialism in Qatar. Or, for instance, Wahab, is one of the waste management companies owned by a very young, successful Qatari, actually female entrepreneur, or another one about manufacturing. And also, of course, you may know Ghanem al-Suwaiti, but the commonality was that the economic behavior also coincided with an ethical behavior, in the sense that for Ghanem, for instance, it was not just about building a company, but it was about recycling and contributing to the economy in a more circular way. So we start to see that economic behavior and ethical behavior were going hand in hand, and it is kind of creating a very nuanced, very localized, very contextualized understanding of entrepreneurial spirit in Qatar. And finally, this shows something very interesting, that Qatar has been doing so well in terms of regional ranking or in terms of global ranking when it comes to entrepreneurship indices. But the one that is relatively weaker is the startup skills that you can interpret from this figure. So, which means that we are on the right way as a project on localizing entrepreneurship education. And this publication actually reassured us that we are on the right track. And once again, special thanks to the organizers and and Professor Rory for giving us this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great. I think I'm going to give you a 7-minute version of my chapter. So if anybody wants to time me and let me know how I did later. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Rory for putting together a great set of papers on the Gulf crisis. In terms of my chapter, although diplomatic rifts and international crises are not overall positive things, my chapter focuses on the opportunities for Qatar's domestic political sphere because of this blockade. In fact, I argue in this chapter that Qatar's domestic politics are being transformed because of the crisis in some very beneficial ways. The genesis of my chapter began with a piece that I published in the Washington Post back in August 2017, when Qatar first began talking about changing its residency laws. 2 days later, the Qatar Tribune reran my article, but they changed the title from "Why did Qatar just change its residency laws?" to "Qatar turns crisis into advantage." So at first, the title change made me laugh, but then it made me think. Is it true That Qatar is using the crisis to its advantage? And I think the answer is clearly a yes. In general, my chapter argues that the blockade has given Qatar the opportunity to break away from the conservative influence of Saudi Arabia and to chart its own course on important social, political, and economic issues. And although an international crisis is never a desired situation, this crisis has allowed Qatar to address and improve several long-standing issues in its own country that were previously hindered by the conservative preferences of other members of the GCC. So we can take the example of citizenship rights for the children of Qatari mothers. As we all know, only Qatari men can pass their citizenship on to their children. And this kind of patriarchal citizenship law is throughout the Gulf, not just in Qatar. And as we also know, citizenship matters in the GCC in large part due to the economic benefits that citizens receive, including free education, health care, land and loans to build a house, help with finding a job, all sorts of things. And if you don't have citizenship, you're not eligible for most of these benefits. So in my 11 years of research on Qatari politics and society, I've paid close attention to the attitudes and opinions of Qataris themselves about the laws of citizenship. For this, I've drawn on the research and initiatives of locals themselves, such as Qatari academics like Dr. Amal al-Malki, who is a dean and researcher at Hamad bin Khalifa University, and who has used social media to call attention to the problems that ensue from these policies, specifically with regards to the children of Qatari mothers and non-Qatari fathers. But I've also been funded by the Qatar National Research Fund to conduct research through both public opinion surveys and ethnographic interviews about Qataris' concerns with these policies. And in surveys conducted in 2013 and again in 2014, 9 out of 10 Qataris, both men and women, supported a change in the laws to allow Qatari women to pass their citizenship down to their children. This means that only 10% of Qataris wanted the law to stay the same. Everyone else wanted the children to have more citizenship rights. But still, even though the citizens were making themselves clear, nothing happened to the law until August 2nd, 2017, when Qatar became the first GCC state to move towards giving non-citizens benefits that are similar to citizens through the permanent residency law, a law that was passed by His Highness the Emir in September of this year. This is not a change to the full citizenship law, but it is a step in the right direction, and it will allow the children of Qatari mothers, as well as some long-term expatriates, to have much happier, more secure, more stable lives in Qatar because they'll be able to enjoy the benefits of education, healthcare, jobs, and more. But still, to outsiders, the question remains, why did this law change now? I mean, since the diplomatic crisis began, Qatar's been pretty busy. They had to change their airline routes, change the ports for shipping, import food from new sources. They even brought in 4,000 cows for a homegrown dairy farm. So why is now the time for Qatar to be worrying about changing domestic policies like the residency law? So in my chapter, I argue that the GCC is now weakened because of the current blockade, and it no longer acts as the coercive force to push countries in line with certain conservative preferences. In other words, the GCC is no longer able to hold countries back from doing what they individually think is best for their own country. From my research over the years, it's pretty clear that Qatari leadership is one of the most progressive in the GCC, but they've been held back by the conservative preferences of the GCC led by Saudi Arabia. Now Qatar doesn't have to listen to Saudi Arabia anymore. The country has a big opportunity to move forward on a lot of different domestic issues that have previously been blocked. And in fact, the residency law is just one of the many things that have changed quickly in Qatar since the blockade began. I mentioned food security, such as the dairy production in Baladna farms, but also policies like improved relations with Iran, free visas and visas on arrival to promote tourism, more opportunities for foreign businesses to own their own projects and buy real estate, improved labor rights for workers, increased respect for Qatari artists, and perhaps most importantly, more space for citizens themselves to voice their opinions and support their government in national development goals, including the appointment of 4 women to the Shura Council for the first time, and promises by the Emir and the Foreign Minister to have elections for the Council in 2019. All of these things are not shallow. They are deep and meaningful changes that have the power to reshape Qatari politics and society in the future. In 5 years, 3 years, 5 years, we might all look back and say that June 5th, 2017 was the moment when things started to change in Qatar, and for the better. So in sum, international conflicts have a way of provoking unintended consequences. The blockade may have been an effort to get Qatar back in line with the conservative GCC politics of the past. But as we have seen instead, it has backfired tremendously. A blockade that was supposed to reinforce the conservative ways of the past is instead leading to rapid progressive change in Qatar, and one could argue elsewhere in the Gulf. And I, for one, am very excited to watch how Qatar continues to use this crisis to its advantage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. All right. Thank you. All right. Last but not least, by no means, is Dr. Tariq Al-Ansari to speak on food security.
Assalamu alaikum. Firstly, I'd like to thank HBKU Press, my fellow authors, and of course Professor Rory for their magnificent efforts in putting the book together. I think it's truly wonderful. My contribution to this book was in the area of food security. Food is a subject we all have some kind of affinity towards. We are all consumers of food. We cannot function without it. We are depressed when we don't eat what we like. And we need it to live an active and healthy life on a daily basis. But the question of food security didn't begin yesterday or last week or last year. Food security is probably one of the only challenges that began with the very existence of man on earth. The need to satisfy hunger was always there. But what started off as a local, basic, primitive system in the early days has now evolved into a complex, multifaceted structure, global structure with integrated supply chains that span from one side of the world to the other. You have countries that export food from one part of the world and countries on the other side of the world importing food. And of course, how you participate in this transaction is governed by your strengths, your weaknesses, and of course, your needs. In the context of Qatar, like many countries, is characterized by a disproportionate distribution of resources. Whilst it is blessed with energy resources, perhaps it doesn't share the same fortune with respect to its water and food resources. And so naturally, it has participated and will continue to participate in the global market to secure its food supply. And so historically, it has imported around 90% of its domestic requirements from the global market. But if we look at the definition of food security, which talks about the availability of food, accessibility of food, to a variety of different food products that give you all the nutrition that you need, you could argue that Qatar was never really food insecure because we always had food on the shelves and we never had trouble getting anything that we wanted. But could you really be food secure if you're dependent on the global market for over 90% of your food requirements? Perhaps not. And this introduces this notion of resilience. How able are you to absorb any disturbances or shocks to the supply chains that you are used to? And so there are with respect to resilience, there are different factors that govern the relationship you have with the global market. For instance, economic factors, such as in 2008, the food price reached its maximum, and Qatar was able to weather this because of its economic strength. But that's when we really started to talk about food security, was back in 2008, and the government launched the National Food Security Program in order to address this and begin the transition of reducing exposure to the global market and to mitigate any vulnerabilities. You have other factors such as natural hazards, so droughts and probably in the future climate change. This could impact the availability of food in the global market and thus have an indirect effect on food price. And then you have geopolitical factors such as war or diplomatic-driven supply chain disruptions, which is what we noticed, or which is what we experienced on June 5th of last year. And what that did was expedite or accelerate an already moving motion of modernizing the food system into something that is not just one-dimensional, relying on the global market, but but a system that has multiple dimensions working together in order to ensure that there's always, at all times, a variety of different, all food is available in the country. And this includes enhancing domestic agriculture, strategic reserves, diversifying your supply chains, and an efficient domestic market. Going forward, it's important that as we modernize our food system, we do so considering certain principles, such as sustainability, consideration for society, the environment, and doing so within a sound economic framework, built upon a strong resilience foundation, such that if any disruption was to occur in any of the different dimensions, that the system will function as per usual. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today and providing just a taste of what is in store for all of you if you do buy the book. I'd just like to thank all the speakers again. Also all the contributors who were not here today but have also contributed fascinating and really excellent analyses of the blockade from their own research perspective. And again, thank you to the organizers and HBKU Press. And finally, because I know that we have to roll it up now, there is a book stall outside. If any of you are interested or intrigued by what you've heard and want to read more, it's available outside. So thank you all for coming and thank you very much.